Dust hung low in the early light, clinging to every wooden beam, every dry leaf, every breath Eliza took as she stepped onto the warped porch. Her hands were still red from digging in the frostbitten earth, trying to unearth the last stubborn potatoes while her daughters slept side by side in the same coat. She hadn't noticed the rider approach, but she heard the nails, 3 of them, slammed into her door with the precision of a man who did it daily and without remorse. Sheriff Callum. Gray beard, gray hat, gray eyes. The kind of man whose silence felt heavier than a threat. "You're late," she said hoarsely, shielding her eyes. The wind stole her shawl's edge and flapped it like a rag. He didn't answer, just pointed at the paper now nailed to her door. Her stomach folded inward. She stepped closer. Her eyes caught on the bolded line. Property seized. Debt to be settled by possessions or persons. Her voice cracked. "This land's mine. My husband paid for." "He lost the deed in cards," Callum said. "To Bishop." The name struck like a slap. Bishop. The saloon keeper. The man who never looked a woman in the eyes just below the chin. "You can't take my girls. Law says collateral's fair game. I'm just the hand, not the hammer." Eliza stepped in front of the door like she could shield them with her shadow. "Then I suggest you get off my land before I fetch my husband's rifle. You do that and they won't be sold. They'll be buried." He tipped his hat like he'd done her a kindness, then turned his horse. She watched the dust bloom around his boots as he rode off toward town, slow as sin. She didn't cry. Not then. Ruth, her eldest, watched from the loft. 11 years old with a gaze like flint. May, 7, clutched a faded rag doll with no name, her face still soft with sleep. "What's collateral mean?" May asked. Eliza didn't answer. Instead, she busied herself with bread she couldn't afford to bake, water she barely had to boil. Her fingers trembled as she shaped dough that would never rise. She wiped them on her skirt and looked out over the fields. Frost glittered over dead vines. Their last cow had been sold 3 weeks ago. The well was half mud. The last letter from her husband's family had read, "You're on your own now." And so she was. The next day the town bell rang twice before noon. That meant a public gathering. That meant the Bishop boys were moving fast. By the time Eliza and her girls reached the square, half the town was already gathered. Some with hats over hearts. Others with coin in their fists. The platform wasn't high. Just enough to make you feel small. "Name?" the clerk asked. "Eliza Marin." "And the girls?" She hesitated. "Ruth, May." The man scribbled. "Ages?" 11. 7. "Healthy." Her jaw clenched. "They're children." He looked up. So were the last ones. That didn't stop the gavel. A low murmur spread as Eliza stepped up. Some pitied her. Others just wanted the spectacle. Bishop leaned against the post, smoking a cigar that glowed like an ember of hell. His grin was wide. "We'll start the bidding low. I'm generous." The gavel rose. And Eliza couldn't breathe. May held Ruth's hand, unsure, barefoot, their dresses mended one too many times. The clerk called out numbers. Eliza heard them through cotton. $10. 12. 15. Ruth flinched when Bishop raised his hand. 25 for the older, he called. Ruth's fingers squeezed tighter. May looked confused. The gavel hovered. And in that moment, Eliza almost screamed. But her voice failed her again. Then someone spoke behind them. "I'll take them both." The voice didn't shout. It cut clean through the noise like a knife through an apple. The kind of voice that didn't need to explain itself. It carried weight. A man stepped from the edge of the crowd. Dusty hat. Sun-leathered skin. Broad shoulders. Calm eyes. He looked like someone who'd lived more in silence than speech. Samuel Hayes. Some folks knew him. Most didn't. He owned a ranch on the outskirts, far from the town's thirst for power and coin. Rumors said he'd once had a family. Others said he'd buried them. "I said I'll take both girls," he repeated. Bishop chuckled. "And what exactly will you do with Cowboy? Teach him how to herd cattle or wash your shirts?" Samuel's eyes narrowed. "I'll set them free." Laughter rippled through the crowd. But not from Eliza. The sheriff frowned. "Ain't how this works, Sam." Samuel reached into his coat. Pulled out a pouch. Dropped it at the clerk's feet. The sound of silver clinking inside silenced everyone. "That enough?" The clerk looked at Bishop. Bishop scowled, but the sheriff nodded. "It'll do." The gavel dropped. The ride back to Samuel's ranch was silent but strange. May sat beside Samuel on the wagon bench, staring at him like he was a riddle. Ruth stayed behind, arms crossed, eyes watching everything. Eliza rode on a mule behind the wagon. Her pride burned. Her shame stung worse. "You didn't have to do that," she muttered as they reached the edge of his land. "No, I didn't." "Then why?" Samuel didn't answer for a long time. The wagon creaked. The prairie rolled by in golden tufts. "Because I've seen what happens to girls left in that man's hands." "And what about us now?" "You'll stay. A while. Get warm. Get strong." "I don't take charity." "I didn't offer it." Eliza stiffened. "Then what's this?" "A choice. You're free to go. But you ain't got to." He pulled the wagon to a stop by a modest house, weather-beaten, quiet, and clean. A barn beside it. Fenced pasture. A well. A porch swing that still moved slightly in the breeze as if someone had just risen from it. That night, after the girls were tucked into the hayloft of the barn and the lanterns were dimmed, Eliza stood outside under the cold moon. She stared out at the horizon, arms wrapped around herself. Samuel came out with 2 mugs. Offered her one. "Coffee?" she asked. "Not much left. Hot water and a pinch of grounds." She took it anyway. They stood in silence. "I failed them," she said. "No, you didn't. I let it happen. You didn't walk away." She looked up at him. The moonlight caught the old scar near his collarbone, barely visible. "You lose someone?" she asked. He nodded. "Wife. And a daughter." Eliza swallowed. "Then why help us? Doesn't it hurt?" Samuel looked toward the barn. "Some hurts ain't meant to fade. But sometimes they can be repurposed." Later, as Eliza lay on a makeshift bed inside the old pantry, she heard Ruth whisper to May, "Do you think he'll keep us safe?" May replied softly, "He didn't blink once." And outside, the wind stirred the dust again. But this time it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something starting. Something uncertain. Fragile. But real. And the hammer, at least for now, had fallen in their favor. Samuel's ranch wasn't much by town standards. One sagging barn. A split-rail fence that leaned toward the horizon. A house built by hands that had known both labor and grief. But to Eliza, it felt unervingly still, like time had curled up and gone quiet here. The girls were fed, bread and beans, and slept in the loft above the main room, curled like pups in borrowed quilts. Eliza stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the wind stir the dying stalks in Samuel's field. "You think it's done?" she asked. Samuel didn't look up from the ledger on his table. "I think they're humiliated." She turned to him. "That's not the same as safe." "No," he said. "It's not." Eliza walked the length of the room slowly, studying the shelves lined with worn books, a rusted rifle hanging over the hearth, a wedding ring nailed into a beam. Her voice softened. "That hers?" He nodded once. "You never took it down?" "Didn't see the point." She leaned against the wall. "Most men would have." He set his pen down. "Most men would have let you burn on that platform too." She didn't reply. Didn't need to. The next morning came hard and cold, breath visible in the early sun. Ruth was already outside, hauling a pail of water with slow, stubborn strength. May sat cross-legged on the porch, rubbing her eyes. "Where's the barn cat?" she asked. "We don't have one," Samuel said from the steps. May frowned. "Why not?" He shrugged. "Too many hawks." May's mouth twisted. "I could be one. A barn cat. If I had whiskers." Samuel smiled without showing teeth. Eliza noticed that. The kind of smile that had been forgotten for years and didn't know how to come back properly. By midday, the heat returned, unseasonable and sharp. Samuel brought out a wagon and hitched it. "Where are you going?" Eliza asked. "Town." Her shoulders tensed. "Alone?" He paused. "I'm not taking the girls with me if that's what you mean." She stepped closer. "You shouldn't go at all. They'll come for you." He looked down at her. "That's the plan. You think they won't shoot you in the street?" He swung up onto the seat. "They might." "You're not God, Mr. Hayes." "No," he said. "But someone's got to speak like they remember what he sounds like." She watched him ride away, dust curling behind the wheels like smoke. The town hadn't changed in a day. Still smelled like horse and whiskey. Still whispered like it had secrets to sell. Samuel walked straight into the sheriff's office and placed 2 papers on the desk. Callum looked up slowly. "You got a habit of causing dust storms." Samuel folded his arms. "These are copies of Bishop's forged deeds. From the notary's own desk. And this," he tapped the second page, "is the original deed to Eliza's land. Not her husband's. Hers." Callum didn't move. "And how'd you get those?" I asked. "Who signed off on it?" Samuel smiled. A woman with 4 sons and no patience for gamblers. Callum leaned back. That's still not the law. Samuel leaned forward. No. But it's the truth. The sheriff looked at the papers for a long time. Then he said, "You know what happens when you strip power from a man who ain't got anything else?" Samuel nodded. "He gets dangerous." Callum sighed. "You planning to keep the girls?" "No. I'm planning to let them stay." "There's a difference." Back at the ranch, Eliza found Ruth sitting on the fence rail, legs swinging, eyes fixed toward the southern ridge. "He's not coming back, is he?" Ruth said quietly. Eliza walked to her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "He said he would." "They all say things," Ruth muttered. "Papa said he'd stop gambling." "That's not the same." "He sold our horse for whiskey." Eliza didn't respond. The truth in Ruth's voice was sharp, edged like flint. She knew better than to dull it with comfort. "He wasn't always like that," she said instead. "But he was in the end." A silence stretched between them, long as the prairie. Eliza could feel her daughter pulling away inside herself, layer by layer, year by year. And she didn't know how to reach through it. "You think Mr. Hayes is different?" Ruth asked. Eliza swallowed. "I don't know what he is yet." Samuel returned that night just before sunset. His face was calm. No blood. No bruises. He brought flour, coffee, and a folded piece of paper. "This is yours now," he said, handing it to Eliza. She unfolded it slowly. The land deed. Her name on it. Not her husband's. Not Bishop's. She looked up at him. "I don't have a way to pay you," she whispered. "I'm not selling." She stared at him for a long moment, then asked the thing she feared most, "What do you want?" He looked her dead in the eye. "Nothing I can take from you. Just something I hope you'll give." She waited. "Peace," he said softly. "For all of you. If you decide to stay." Later, while the girls played with seed sacks and giggled in the barn, Eliza cleaned dishes by lantern light. Samuel sat outside, whittling something into the dark. "I don't know how to accept kindness anymore," she said through the window. "You don't have to," he replied. "It ain't a contract. But I feel like I'm still owned." "You were never owned. You were just surrounded by men who told you otherwise." She turned toward the light and leaned on the sill. "Why are you alone?" He kept whittling. "I was too late." "Too late for what?" "For them." Her breath caught. "They were taken?" she asked. He nodded. "Sickness came hard. I rode for help. Storm came faster." Eliza felt the chill of it, loss that came when you were doing your best and it still wasn't enough. "That why you helped us?" He paused. "Part of it. And the rest. I don't like men who buy people." That night, as the fire crackled and wind pressed gentle fingers against the window panes, Ruth crept downstairs. She stood over Samuel, who had dozed in the chair with a book in his lap. "Mr. Hayes?" He blinked awake. "Yes, Ruth?" She held something in her hand. The doll. Its one eye stitched in crooked thread. "She said it's good luck," Ruth said, placing it in his lap. "But I think it's more about memory." He looked at the doll. Then at her. "I'll keep it close." She nodded once and turned to go. "Ruth?" She stopped. "Your mother's stronger than you know." Ruth didn't turn back. But she smiled. In the days that followed, things settled into a rhythm. Eliza helped repair a broken gate. Ruth read books aloud to May. Samuel showed them where the best berries grew, deep behind the hills where hawks flew low and silent. But peace, Eliza knew, never lasted long out here. Especially when men felt humiliated. Especially when Bishop still held grudges. One afternoon, while Samuel was out checking fence lines, a rider came fast across the plain. Dust in his wake. A red bandana across his mouth. Eliza stepped out with the rifle in hand, Ruth behind her with a bucket still swinging. The rider didn't slow until the last second. "Message from Bishop," the man growled. "He says you've got 1 week to return what's his, or next time it won't be paper." "What's his?" Eliza hissed. "The girls, the land, the dignity." She leveled the rifle. "You tell Bishop he never had any of those." The rider grinned. "We'll see who's still talking by week's end." He turned and rode off into the dust, leaving the silence behind him sharp and splintered. That evening, Samuel returned to find Eliza standing by the porch, rifle at her side, eyes hard. "They sent a warning." He nodded. "I expected it. What do we do?" He looked toward the hills, where the sky burned orange and the birds flew low. "We hold the line." "You think we're ready for that?" "No," he said. "But sometimes readiness comes after the fire, not before." The sun dipped. Shadows stretched. And inside the house, Ruth and May braided each other's hair, humming the song their mother used to sing before the world taught her to stop. Out here, memory didn't ask for permission. It simply returned, through smells, through firelight, through the stillness of men who spoke less and meant more. And somewhere deep in Eliza's ribs, just beneath the fear, something else had started to grow. Not hope. Not yet. But something near it. Something shaped like resolve. The sky cracked open that night. Thunder rolled like a drumbeat from God's warpath, and the wind howled over Samuel's ranch as though the land itself knew something was coming. Eliza bolted upright in the dark, her pulse thudding against her throat like a warning. Beside her, Ruth stirred. In the loft above, May muttered in her sleep. The smell reached them first, acrid and sharp like burning rope and pitch. "Samuel," Eliza whispered, scrambling from the cot. He was already outside, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the orange glow rising from the barn. The fire had teeth. Flames licked through the roof like a monster's tongue, devouring beams and shadows alike. The animals were already gone, let out before the blaze took hold. But Samuel's expression didn't ease. Eliza reached him, hair whipping in the wind. "It was them," she said. He nodded once. "Bishop's boys." They watched the barn fall in on itself, cinders launching into the night sky like dying stars. Eliza stood with her jaw clenched and hands shaking, while Ruth stood behind them both, silent and unmoving. "They'll burn more than your barn," Eliza said. "Next time it'll be the house. Or us." Samuel turned to her. His face was calm, but the firelight painted a storm in his eyes. "They want to make us run," he said. "They're succeeding." "No," he said. "They're provoking us. There's a difference." By morning, all that remained was a black skeleton, smoke still curling from the beams like breath from a grave. May wept when she saw the melted remains of her rag doll in the ash. Ruth didn't speak at all. Samuel worked through the wreckage with quiet hands. Eliza helped him drag what could be salvaged into a pile: burnt nails, half-charred tools, a horseshoe fused with heat. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was concentrated. "Where do we go from here?" Eliza asked. Samuel didn't stop working. "Forward. That's not a direction. That's a wish." He straightened. "It's a decision." She studied him. "You always this calm when people try to burn you alive?" He glanced at her. "Only when I expected it." Later that day, while the girls fetched water and tried to act like the world wasn't tipping beneath them, Eliza and Samuel sat at the table, ink and paper between them. "I want to write to the judge," Eliza said. "Send proof of the forged deeds. Ask for a hearing." Samuel shook his head. "He's Bishop's cousin. That letter won't leave the county." Eliza's lips twisted. "Then what?" "We wait." "For what?" Samuel's gaze was level. "For them to step too far." That night, Ruth refused supper. She sat on the porch rail, watching the dark settle in over the hills. Eliza found her there, arms folded, eyes hard as obsidian. "You think he can protect us?" Ruth didn't look away. "He's just a man. And they're a mob." Eliza sat beside her. "He's not trying to be a hero." "Then why's he risking everything?" Eliza didn't answer at first. Then quietly, "Maybe he's not risking everything. Maybe we are." Ruth blinked. "You ever think we're not just being saved, Ruth?" Eliza asked. "That maybe we're the ones saving something too?" The next morning, a note appeared on the fence post, tied with red string. No signature. "Last warning. Leave by Sunday. Or we'll bury the choice." Samuel read it aloud, then burned it without a word. Eliza felt a knot in her throat. "They won't stop, Samuel." "I know. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." "You're not. You already lost your barn. I've lost worse." The way he said it, quiet, not bitter, made her chest ache. "I'll understand if you ask us to go," she said. "I won't. Even if it means they hurt you?" He looked at her like the question itself wounded him. "I won't," he repeated. Ruth began waking with nightmares. She wouldn't describe them, but Eliza knew what they were: flames, chains, crowds of men who smiled with no warmth. May, too young to understand the depth of danger, began shadowing Samuel, asking endless questions. He answered each one with a patience Eliza hadn't seen in years, as if kindness were something he practiced like scripture. "What's a sheriff do?" "Depends on the town." "Did you have a daughter?" "I did." "Did she braid her hair like me?" "She did." "Was she funny?" "She was everything." May didn't ask again after that. just leaned her head on his shoulder and stayed quiet a while. 3 days later, the Bishop brothers returned. They didn't knock. They came at dawn with 3 riders, guns holstered but visible, and smirks slick with certainty. Samuel met them outside, coat unbuttoned, rifle across his lap. "Back for what's not yours?" he asked. The eldest, Dirk Bishop, chewed a stalk of grass. "Thought we'd be neighborly. Make sure no one's squatting where they shouldn't be." "This is her land," Samuel said. Dirk glanced at Eliza, who'd stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "Women can't own land here. Not without a husband." "She doesn't need one," Samuel said. Dirk smiled slowly. "Then she'll need a coffin." Samuel stood. "Say that again." "I said." The gun was drawn before Dirk could finish. Samuel didn't fire. He didn't need to. Just the motion, the silence, the steady hand was enough. "Next time," Samuel said, "you'll bury your own brother if you try something stupid." Dirk sneered. "You'll regret this, Hayes." Samuel lowered the barrel. "Only thing I regret is not firing already." They rode off, slower than they came but not defeated. "Not yet." Eliza turned to Samuel after they were gone. "That bluff won't work twice." "I know. So, we prepare." That night, as the stars scattered like frost across the sky, Eliza brought a quilt out to where Samuel sat beneath the porch lantern. "You don't sleep much," she said. "I sleep when it's safe." She sat beside him, the quiet, thick and kind. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For standing with us. Even now. Even after the fire. I don't see another way I'd want to live. You didn't even know us a month ago." "I didn't need to." "Why?" He hesitated, then said, "Because I saw what it did to you. That day. On that platform. I saw the look in your eyes, and it was the same one I wore when they buried my family." She turned to him. "And what was that look?" "Grief trying to pretend it was rage. Because rage feels stronger. But it isn't. It just burns longer." She blinked tears away. "And what's stronger than both?" He met her gaze. "The will to stay." Inside, Ruth lay beside May, the firelight flickering across their faces. "Do you think we'll have to leave again?" May whispered. "No," Ruth said, stroking her sister's hair. "I think this time we stay. Even if it's hard." May yawned. "Do you trust him?" Ruth hesitated. "I think I trust how Mama looks at him," she finally said. In the yard, the ash from the barn had settled like snow. Soft, silent, but not gone. Just waiting for the next storm. And this time they'd be ready for it. It happened just before dawn, when the world was still brittle with frost and silence. Eliza had barely slipped on her boots when Samuel burst through the door, eyes dark with warning. "They're coming." She didn't need to ask who. He'd seen the dust cloud on the ridge. 5 riders. Armed. Heading straight for them. Eliza turned, grabbed the girls from their sleeping spots in the loft. Ruth was already reaching for her boots. May, half asleep, clung to her doll's remains and asked, "Is it the bad men?" "Yes," Eliza said, strapping on her satchel, "but we're not going to let them win." By the time the wagon was loaded, the sky had begun to pale, streaks of gray brushing the distant peaks. Samuel hitched the mule team fast, his movements clean and efficient. No wasted breath. "They know this land better than we do," he muttered, checking the rifle tucked beneath the seat. "We can't outrun them. But we can outsmart them." Eliza climbed into the wagon, girls beside her. "Where are we headed?" "To the crossing." "The canyon trail?" He nodded. "They can't follow us narrow there. But it'll be close." She didn't argue. She trusted him now, in that unspoken way that came when someone had stood between you and fire, and hadn't flinched. The ride was rough. Ruts deep. Ice still clinging to the grass. The wagon wheels bounced over frozen mud and dried roots. Samuel rode ahead on horseback, scanning the horizon, hand never straying far from his rifle. Behind them the sound came, hoofbeats distant but gaining. Eliza glanced back, heart seizing. The riders were there. 5 shadows galloping through dust, one holding something long and gleaming. "They've seen us," she said. Samuel didn't look back. "Let them. That's part of it." He veered left, guiding them through a rocky incline where the trail narrowed and climbed. "This way. Stay close to the wall." Branches scraped the sides of the wagon. The mule wheezed from the climb. May clung to her mother's arm. Ruth held a small knife Samuel had given her, though she barely knew how to grip it. The first gunshot cracked through the canyon like thunder. Eliza ducked low over the girls, heart pounding in her ears. Samuel turned his horse sharp, returned fire. One of the riders reeled back, horse bucking sideways. "For left," he called out. They reached a narrow bend where the canyon wall curved hard. The river roared below, a steep drop but shallow enough to cross on foot if they had to. Samuel dismounted. "We'll make our stand here." Eliza jumped down, grabbing the rifle from the wagon. "They'll pin us," she said. "We've got no cover." "They'll think that. Until they're in range." He handed her a wrapped bundle from the saddlebag, dynamite sticks. Eliza stared. "Where the hell?" "Mining days. Kept them dry." She took one. "You plan on throwing this?" "I plan on ending this." The first of the Bishop boys came too fast, riding high with a pistol raised and a mouth full of victory. Samuel fired once. The man jerked back like pulled by a string and fell from the saddle. 3 left. Gunfire cracked again. A bullet splintered a rock inches from Eliza's shoulder. Ruth screamed but didn't run. She dropped behind the wagon, pulling May down with her. "Stay low," Eliza shouted. One of the riders dismounted and began flanking. Samuel saw it too late. Eliza moved. Fast. No hesitation. She slid along the edge of the canyon, aimed and pulled the trigger. The man dropped. 2 left. But one had already reached the top of the ridge. Dirk Bishop himself, teeth clenched around a cigar, rifle aimed straight at Samuel's chest. "You always were the quiet type, Hayes," he growled, spitting the cigar out. "Guess I'll quiet you for good." Samuel turned, but not fast enough. The shot rang out. But it wasn't Dirk's rifle that fired. It was Ruth. The shot was wild, but close enough to make Dirk duck and curse. It gave Samuel the second he needed. He rolled, fired once, and Dirk's leg gave out beneath him. The outlaw screamed, tumbled backward, and over the edge. They heard the splash below. The last rider turned and fled. Silence fell. Not the kind of silence that comes from absence, but the kind that comes from survival. From blood cooling in the dust. From breath held too long and finally exhaled. Eliza dropped the rifle. Her hands were shaking. Samuel sat back against a boulder, clutching his shoulder. A grazing wound, but deep enough to bleed. "You're hurt," she said. He smiled faintly. "Just enough to remember I'm still alive." Ruth stepped out from behind the wagon, the small pistol in her hand still trembling. Eliza rushed to her. Where did you?" "He gave it to me," Ruth said, voice hollow. "In case you couldn't stop them." Eliza pulled her into a hug so tight Ruth whimpered. But she didn't let go. Samuel stood slowly, eyes scanning the trail. "That's the end of them." "For now," Eliza said. "No. I mean it. The Bishop line's broken. His brothers were cowards. They won't come back. Not after this." He looked down at the canyon. "Blood at the crossing," he murmured. "Just like my wife." Eliza looked up at him. "What do you mean?" He didn't speak for a long time. Then, "The same river. Years ago. We tried to make it through a flash flood. Lost the wagon. Lost her. Lost the girl." Eliza's throat closed. "And you came back here anyway?" "I didn't. Not until I saw you on that platform." She reached for his hand. He let her take it. "You think it's over?" she asked. "No," he said. "But I think it's changing." They buried the dead near the river, marked the graves with stones. No names. Just silence. On the way back, the girls sat in the wagon, heads resting on one another. The wind was colder now and the sky heavy with dusk. Eliza sat beside Samuel. His sleeve was blood-soaked, but his face was clear. "You saved us," she said. He shook his head. "You saved yourselves. I just bought you time. You risked your life. So did you." She looked at him. "Are we free now?" He didn't answer. But the land looked different. Quieter. The kind of quiet earned, not given. When they reached the ranch, the scorched barn stood like a scar, but they didn't look at it the same way anymore. Eliza stepped down, helped Ruth and May out, then turned to Samuel. "Come inside," she said softly. He hesitated, then followed. The fire was already lit. The girls curled up near it. Eliza brought out coffee. No sugar. No milk. Just warmth. They drank in silence. When the fire cracked, Eliza turned. "You know," she said, "a man once told me grief tries to dress itself in rage, but that it isn't stronger." Samuel met her eyes. "And what is?" She smiled. "The will to stay." The morning after the canyon crossing, the world looked rebuilt. Not repaired, there was still ash in the fields and blood in the riverbed, but the fear that once curled around Eliza's ribs like wire had finally loosened. She stood by the fence post, watching the girls race across the frost-laced grass, their laughter rising like birds into the cold blue. Ruth chased May in a slow circle, hair flying, cheeks pink with life. There was something new in Ruth's stride, confidence, not hardened but tempered. Eliza had seen her daughter look over her shoulder every day for a year. Now she didn't. Samuel stood a few yards off, arms folded, left shoulder still stiff from the wound, his expression unreadable. "They're lighter today," she said. He nodded without taking his eyes off the girls. "They earned it." She glanced toward the barn's charred skeleton. "We all did." Word spread faster than wildfire in a town starved for gossip. By midweek, every saloon, stable, and church pew echoed with the same whispered tale. Bishop was gone, the outlaw line broken by a widowed woman and a rancher with no taste for crowds. Some said the sheriff finally grew a spine. Others said God had. Sheriff Callum rode out to the ranch that Friday with a paper in hand and sweat on his brow. He dismounted without speaking, handed the folded document to Eliza, and removed his hat. She unfolded it. A formal decree. Her name. Her land. Full rights restored. "I thought the law wasn't on my side," she said. Callum glanced at Samuel. "Turns out, sometimes it just needs a shove." He rode off without asking for coffee or pleasantries. Eliza watched him go. "That's not a man used to losing." "No," Samuel said. "But maybe he's tired of backing the wrong side." The next week, the preacher came. He brought building supplies and 2 young men to help rebuild the barn. He didn't say much, just rolled up his sleeves and hammered planks with a kind of penance. May made them lemonade with wild mint and too much water, and Ruth tried to learn how to use a handsaw without taking off a finger. Samuel let her. They worked together in a rhythm that felt like healing. Dust and sweat. Timber and laughter. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in copper streaks. It was Ruth who said it first. "You should stay, Mr. Hayes." He looked at her, startled. "I live here." She shook her head. "Not just live. Stay. With us." May added, "You're already part of the family." Eliza didn't speak right away. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers twined. "We don't have much," she said, voice quiet. "You have more than most," he replied. "You still keep your wife's ring on that beam." Samuel turned his eyes to the doorframe, where the gold band hung like a quiet memory. "I do." "Does that mean there's no room for anyone else?" He didn't answer for a long time. Then, with great care, he rose, walked to the beam, and took the ring down. He held it in his palm a moment. Then he placed it in a wooden box, shut the lid, and set it on the mantel. "I'll never forget her," he said. "But maybe remembering doesn't have to mean stopping." Eliza stood. "I don't want someone to fix my life. I don't want to be someone's redemption. I don't want to be needed," she said. "I just want to be chosen." Samuel stepped close. "Then let me choose you." The air shifted. Not dramatic. Not thunderous. Just something small and undeniable, like the way fire starts from a single ember. Eliza reached out, took his hand, and didn't let go. On the first day of spring, the town held a gathering. A new barn now stood behind Samuel's house, sturdy and wide. The townsfolk brought food, music, and hesitant goodwill. The preacher blessed the harvest. The blacksmith's daughter brought wildflowers. No one spoke of the fire. Or the blood. But they all looked at Eliza differently now. As someone who had stood on an auction block, and climbed back down on her own terms. Ruth wore a blue ribbon in her hair. May clutched a carved wooden bird Samuel had made her. They didn't flinch when people looked their way. They smiled. Eliza stood near the door, dress pressed, face clean, back straight. A young woman approached her with trembling lips and eyes too familiar. "They're still threatening women," the girl said. "In the back rooms. With paper and promises." Eliza met her gaze. "Then we don't run anymore." The girl blinked. "We. All of us," Eliza said. "Every last one." That night, after the guests had gone and the lanterns were doused, Samuel and Eliza stood on the porch, the prairie stretching wide before them. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stepped forward that day?" she asked. "All the time." "What do you see?" He shook his head. "Nothing I'd want to live with." She leaned against him, resting her head on his uninjured shoulder. "You didn't just set them free," she said. "No. You set me free too." And as the wind moved across the tall grass like a lullaby, Eliza closed her eyes and let herself believe something she hadn't dared in years. That a woman could be broken and still be worth choosing. That daughters could be stolen from a platform and still end up laughing in the sun. That sometimes the quietest men carry the fiercest kind of love. And that maybe, just maybe, when the world writes you off, it's not the end of the story. Sometimes it's the part where you stop surviving and start living. The wind moved across the frozen prairie like a memory too painful to forget, soft at first, then sharp. Laura Bullion Holland stepped outside her cabin wrapped in her late husband's coat, the sleeves still too long, the wool worn smooth where his arms had once bent. She pulled it tighter around her, stepping into snow already knee-high in drifts. Her boots creaked beneath her, and the sky hung low, heavy with another storm. She didn't plan to wander far. Just down past the fence line, where the scrub oak trees rattled like bones in the wind, and a few good branches might still be dry enough to burn. Her kindling pile had grown low, and the fire inside her home, her only warmth, was already struggling. The land was silent except for the crows overhead, circling toward the east. She watched them a moment, breath showing in pale clouds. Then her gaze dropped. A figure. She thought it was a deer at first, collapsed in the snow. But the shape was wrong, too still, too small. She stepped forward, her heart catching in her throat as the wind flared again, lifting the edge of a red cloth beneath the white. It was a boy. Barely more than 8 or 9. Maybe 10. His hair was black as coal and tangled in windswept strands across his face. His leg was twisted oddly beneath him, one boot missing. Blood had frozen into a dark stain on his pants, dried at the edge of a tear along his thigh. For a second, Laura Bullion stood motionless, arms limp at her sides. She hadn't touched another soul in months. And now, this. She crouched slowly, brushing snow from his face with the back of her sleeve. His skin was burning cold but not stiff. When she pressed her hand to his neck, she found a pulse, thin but still there. His lips moved faintly, breath a whisper she couldn't catch. Navajo. That word slid into her chest like a warning, but also, somehow, a sorrow. She looked up. The trees were still. No tracks in the snow but her own. Laura Bullion didn't hesitate again. She slid her arms beneath him and stood with a grunt, the boy limp against her chest, lighter than she expected. His face fell against her collar. She didn't look back. Inside the cabin, the fire had nearly died. She laid him on the cot, her cot, and moved quickly. Quilts. Clean rags. A pot of water heated with what little flame remained. She stoked the coals and breathed into the heart of them until they caught again. She cut away the torn pant leg. A bullet. No exit wound. She said nothing as she worked, just pressed her lips together and did what needed doing. He didn't cry out when she cleaned the wound, just clenched his fists until his knuckles showed white. Laura Bullion wrapped the leg tightly and covered him in every blanket she owned. The wind outside moaned like it wanted in. She sat by the fire with her hands out, listening to the kettle rattle. Her eyes flicked to him, his chest rising slow, his mouth parted. How had he come to be alone out there? Her gaze wandered to the rifle hanging by the door. She hadn't spoken aloud in 3 days, not even to herself. But now she whispered to the room, to no one. Lord, what have you sent me? The boy stayed unconscious through the night. She barely slept. Sat by the fire as shadows stretched and shifted, the candle burning low. She dozed in a chair and jerked awake at every noise. In the darkness she remembered her son, how small he'd been when the fever took him. How still. This boy was about the same age. That thought didn't leave her. At first light, she stepped out to gather more wood and found the snow deeper than ever. A thick hush hung over the land, broken only by the whistle of wind through fence wire. As she bent to lift a branch, her eyes caught something. Hoofprints. Near the edge of the trees, half covered by drift. More than one set. Some turning in, others circling. She straightened, heart hammering. Someone had passed near recently. She hurried back inside. The boy was awake. He didn't sit up. Didn't speak. But his eyes followed her as she moved. Dark, steady, full of something older than his years. When she offered him water, he drank without a word. When she tried to ask his name, he only blinked. After a while she stopped asking. He didn't trust her. She couldn't blame him. But he didn't try to leave either. That afternoon she gave him a bowl of broth and he ate slow, careful. Watching her the entire time. She let the silence grow between them like a wall neither wanted to climb. By evening he stood on one leg by the fire, leaning against the wall, trying to stretch. You shouldn't walk yet, she said gently. He glanced down at his foot but said nothing. She sat near the fire, stirring the stew pot, and tried again. My name's Laura Bullion. The boy looked at her. After a long pause he nodded. Progress. She handed him a folded shirt. Her son's. Too small for a grown man, too large for him, but clean. He took it without a word and pulled it over his shoulders. She watched the way he moved, stiff, cautious, wary. That night, as the wind died and the coals flickered, she told him a story. Just one. About the old cottonwood tree where her son used to sit. How the branches would rattle in storms like they were clapping for thunder. She didn't know why she spoke, but it felt right. The boy didn't move or speak, but he listened. She saw that in his stillness. In the morning, he was already awake when she opened her eyes. Sitting by the fire, poking the embers with a stick. "Want to try saying something today?" she asked. Silence. She didn't press. Instead, she slid the stew pot closer and said, "There's food." He took the bowl without thanks. Ate in silence. She didn't mind. After breakfast, he helped her stack wood inside. Not because she asked, but because he noticed the empty basket. Carried what he could. His legs still dragged, but he was strong. That night, as she braided her hair, he stared at her hands. She smiled faintly. "You ever see snow like this before?" "Nothing." She looked away. "You don't have to talk. But I hope you know I'm not your enemy." The candlelight caught his face then and something flickered. He said, barely above a whisper, "Tahano." She turned back to him. "My name?" he added, staring at the flame. She swallowed. "Tahano." The syllables felt sacred in her mouth. He didn't look at her again. But later, when the fire crackled low, he unfolded one of her son's drawings from under the cot and set it gently on the table. A gesture of thanks. Or trust. She didn't touch it. Just whispered, "You can stay as long as you need, Tahano." And in the quiet that followed, with wind sighing past the walls and the coals glowing gold, she swore she saw his shoulders drop just slightly. As if the weight of running had finally paused. Just for the night. Just long enough to be warm. The snow didn't fall that morning. It simply waited. Outside, the prairie was a sea of white, unbroken except for the black bones of fence posts jutting through drifts. Inside the cabin, the warmth held steady. The fire had not died in the night, and neither had the boy. Tahano sat on the floor near the hearth, cross-legged and still. His eyes followed the sparks that leapt upward into the dark mouth of the chimney, like they were trying to return somewhere they'd come from. Laura Bullion watched him from across the room. Her hands worked dough on the table, pressing and folding, but her attention stayed on the boy with the name that sounded like stone warmed by sun. He hadn't said another word since last night. But something had shifted. He hadn't flinched when she brushed his shoulder. He hadn't pulled away when she'd helped him tie the spare shirt around his waist like a sash. His silences had stopped being walls. They had become rooms she might one day walk into. Laura Bullion placed the dough in the skillet and set it on the hook above the fire. The scent of flour and salt drifted through the air. Tahano didn't turn his head, but she saw the tiniest twitch of his nose. "You ever cook?" she asked softly. He didn't answer. She didn't expect him to. "Not many boys your age would have survived that storm," she said. "Especially not with a wound like that." Still no answer. "I think you're braver than most men I've met." He shifted slightly. Not away. Just toward the warmth. She smiled to herself, small and private. Later that morning, as she chopped carrots for the stew, she caught him watching her knife. Not out of fear, but memory. She spoke without looking at him. "You were taught to use one?" A beat passed. Then, quiet as snow settling on pine, he nodded once. She slid a second blade from the drawer, shorter, duller, and set it near him. He hesitated. Then reached out and took it. Side by side, they peeled vegetables without speaking. The rhythmic sound of blade on wood became the only conversation they needed. When she sliced her finger and hissed, he was already holding out a clean strip of cloth from the stack. Laura Bullion looked at him and laughed softly, a sound that surprised them both. "You're a good helper," she said, wrapping her finger. Tahano didn't smile. But he didn't look away either. That night, the wind returned. Not furious, just whispering. The kind of wind that made the roof creak and the lantern flicker, that made you think of footsteps when none were there. They ate together in silence. Tahano sat on a low stool, one leg still stiff, but he no longer looked like he was preparing to bolt. His eyes moved from the fire to the bowl to her face, then back again. After supper, she opened her sewing box and sat in her rocking chair. It groaned beneath her, same as it had for years. She reached for a sock with a hole and began darning it. Tahano sat across from her, tracing a stick in the ash of the hearth. When she glanced up, she realized he was drawing something. A symbol. Curved lines and marks. Not random. She leaned forward slightly. "What's that mean?" He paused, then rubbed it away. She didn't ask again. Instead, she pulled out a piece of cloth and handed it to him. "You want to show me? Use this next time." He took it gently, folded it once, set it aside. That night, he slept on the cot again, curled beneath the quilt. Laura Bullion lay on the floor near the fire, her blanket thin but the heat from the coals enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. Before sleep took her, she turned to him and whispered, "You're not alone now." She didn't know if he heard. In the morning she found him already dressed, coat too big, boots loose. He stood at the door, looking out at the pale light creeping across the snow-covered land. "I was going to feed the hens," she said behind him. He stepped aside. She opened the door. The wind hit her like a breath held too long. The coop was buried halfway to the roofline, but the birds had survived. She cracked the ice off their water and scattered corn. When she turned, he was standing beside the fence, looking east. "What do you see?" she asked. No answer. But she followed his gaze and saw a hawk, gliding low across the sky. Wings wide. Silent. They both watched it disappear. Later, as they sat together again, him near the fire, her in the chair, she began to speak. Not about the present. Not about fear or worry. But about her husband. His name was Michael. He had a crooked smile and bad knees from falling off horses more than once. Thought he could teach me to ride better. I proved him wrong. Tejano said nothing. He died 3 winters back. Fever took him quick. Buried him by the cottonwood. Her voice didn't break. Not anymore. She had told the story enough times to smooth out the edges. My son Levi, her breath caught. He didn't make it through the next spring. The boy's eyes lifted. He looked at her, not through her. She nodded slowly. It's been just me since. Quiet gets loud after a while. Tejano tilted his head. Quiet is safe. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken. Laura Bullion looked at him like he'd just laid a stone in the middle of a river she hadn't crossed in years. Sometimes, she said, quiet's just lonely dressed up. Tejano's eyes dropped. He traced a shape in the ash again, this time not hiding it. A curved sun with lines falling beneath it like light. What's that mean? She asked. He didn't erase it. Home, he said. When the sun rests. Laura Bullion stared at the shape for a long time. Is your father alive? Tejano's face hardened. He didn't answer, but his hand curled tight around the stick. She reached across and set a hand near his. If you ever want to talk about it, you can. He didn't move, but his breathing deepened. That night, a storm passed overhead without breaking. Lightning flickered in the sky far off. The air was sharp, full of tension, but the wind didn't howl. They sat in candlelight, not speaking. And when he drifted to sleep, she pulled the quilt higher over him and brushed the hair from his forehead like a mother would, without thinking. He stirred but didn't wake. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt like healing. The air changed before the storm did. Laura Bullion felt it in her chest before she saw it in the sky, a strange pressure like something was holding its breath. She stood at the edge of the cabin, eyes narrowed toward the tree-line. The stillness was wrong. The silence wasn't the good kind anymore. Tejano stood beside her, leaning on the cane she'd carved for him from an old broom handle. He didn't speak. His eyes, always older than his years, tracked the same tree line, as if he sensed it too. It had been 5 days since she found him in the snow. 5 days of firelight and slow brewing trust. He still spoke little, but he no longer looked for the door when she got too close. They developed a rhythm, quiet mornings, wordless meals, a shared warmth that filled more than just the room. But that morning, Tejano didn't eat. He sat with his back straight, listening. Something wrong? She asked. He nodded once, then pointed. Hoof prints. Not old ones either. Laura Bullion stepped out, rifle slung across her back. Her boots broke through the crusted snow as she walked the perimeter of the cabin. At first, she saw nothing, just the usual wind-carved ripples, the shallow trails she and Tejano made gathering wood. Then she saw them. 6 prints. Not from their own horses, she hadn't owned one since Michael died. These were recent. Brought. Men riding heavy and slow, passing just wide enough not to be seen from the window. Circling. Her blood chilled despite the sun overhead. She crouched and touched the edge of one print. Still soft. They'd been there. Watching. Back inside, she shut the door with more force than she meant to. Tejano was already standing, eyes alert. We need to be ready, she said. If someone's tracking you, they might come. He didn't ask who. He already knew. That night, Laura Bullion barred the door with an old beam she hadn't moved in years. She showed Tejano how to wedge it just right. Taught him which floorboard creaked near the window. Where to stand if the fire needed to be hidden. They didn't sleep much. Just sat near the coals, a small pot of broth between them, neither hungry enough to eat. Laura Bullion looked over at him. You know who might be looking for you? He hesitated. Then, in a voice roughened by disuse, my father. Or men who want him dead. Her breath caught. Your father alive? She asked. He nodded. He was ambushed. Near water. I ran. Thought he died. Who were the men? Tehano's jaw tightened. Not from his band. Riders with white coats. One with a long scar. Laura Bullion's mind raced. Traitors? Hired guns? Settlers who'd gotten too bold? You think they'd follow you this far? She asked. He looked at her like she already knew the answer. Later that day, while Tehano rested, she found him drawing in the dirt beside the hearth again. This time he wasn't hiding it. The marks were cleaner, sharper. A symbol, 2 mountains, a sun between, and arrows crossing beneath. She crouched beside him. What does it mean? War. Between bands. My father tried to stop it. And they punished him? He nodded. The sky darkened that evening without rain. Just a thick, pressing weight. Laura Bullion stacked the last of the firewood inside and boiled enough water to last through the night. She laid out extra candles. Put 2 blankets beside the cot. She watched him across the room. How he stood straighter now. How he didn't flinch when her hand brushed his shoulder. You're not running anymore, she said softly. I'm not alone. 3 words. Clear. Certain. She blinked back the sudden burn in her eyes. You're not, she whispered. Not ever again. After supper, Tehano pulled the old rifle down from above the door. He couldn't lift it well, it was too big for his frame, but he ran his hand along it like it meant something to him. She didn't stop him. Michael's, she said. He carved the stock himself. Tehano nodded. It has honor. He leaned it back in place with care. The wind picked up just before midnight. Not wild. Not frantic. Just constant. Like breath on a neck. Laura Bullion sat in her rocking chair, rifle across her lap. Tehano lay awake under the quilt, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Neither spoke. And then, hoofbeats. Distant. Slow. Laura Bullion stood without a word and moved to the window. The curtain was thin. The moonlight filtered through clouds, casting long shadows across the snow. Riders. At least 8 of them moving in a wide arc keeping distance. Watching the cabin. She backed away from the window and pressed her back to the door. Tehano sat up, jaw clenched. They'll wait for daylight, he said. How do you know? Because they want fear to settle first. Laura Bullion felt the chill crawl up her spine. She handed him a pouch of dried meat and her old boots. Keep them near. If we need to move, we move fast. But Tehano didn't take them. He looked at her, quiet but certain. I won't run again. The next morning arrived too slowly. Pale light crawled across the floorboards like a promise it couldn't keep. Laura Bullion opened the door just enough to see. Nothing. The riders had vanished. But the tracks hadn't. She followed them, rifle slung again, breath fogging. Every step took her further from safety, deeper into that wide open cold. Then she saw it. A bundle of cedar. Tied with twine. Left beside the tree line like an offering. A sign. She brought it back and showed Tehano. His face changed, recognition then dread. It's his, he whispered. Your father's? He nodded. It means he lives. But he's watched. He can't come. Laura Bullion felt her knees give a little, and she sat down hard on the edge of the chair. He's close then, she said. Close enough to send this. They burned the cedar in the hearth that night. Not for warmth, but because it mattered. The smoke smelled sweeter than pine. Tehano leaned into it like he was home again just for a moment. He didn't cry. But Laura Bullion saw how his hands trembled when the last branch turned to ash. That night he whispered, if they come for me, will you let them take me? She didn't answer right away. She walked over, crouched beside his cot, and looked him in the eye. No. His face shifted, something between fear and faith. You should sleep, she said, brushing the edge of the quilt. Will you? I'll be right here. And she was. Even after the candle died. Even after the wind rose again. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft and relentless, burying the tracks of the men who waited. But not the choices that were coming. Dawn didn't break that morning, it slipped in. Soft and silver, it crept across the prairie like a ghost too tired to haunt. The snow hadn't stopped in the night, but it had lightened. Now it rested like a blanket smoothed by unseen hands. Laura Bullion stood at the cabin window, arms wrapped tight around herself. The fire behind her had burned low, but she hadn't dared move to stoke it. Not yet. Tehano sat upright on the cot, already dressed. His shoulders squared, eyes alert. There was no boy in him this morning. Only someone waiting for something that might change everything. And then they came. The sound came first. Not fast. Not loud. Many. Moving as one. Laura Bullion's hand tightened on the curtain's edge. She counted 6 riders. Then 10. Then more. They moved like shadows at first, black against white. And then in the thinning mist she saw the formation. 20. Riders wrapped in furs and bone necklaces, paint streaked across their faces, feathers tied into long braids. Some bore rifles, others bows. All watched the cabin in silence. At the front rode a man alone. He dismounted without a word, his boots crunching the frost-bitten ground. His walk was slow, deliberate. He carried no weapon in his hands, but the weight of command was draped over his shoulders like a second cloak. Tahano whispered the name before Laura Bullion could ask. Chaska. His voice broke around it, like it had waited too long to be spoken. Laura Bullion looked at him, then back at the door. A breath caught in her lungs. Chaska stopped 10 paces from the cabin. Then he knelt, one knee to the earth, and touched his palm to the ground. A sign not of weakness, but of reverence. Or warning. Laura Bullion stepped forward. She didn't take the rifle. She opened the door slowly, letting the cold spill into the room like a judgment. Chaska stood. Their eyes met. His face was carved from weather and war. A scar split his lower lip. His eyes were dark and steady, unreadable. But something flickered in them as he looked past her and into the room, at the boy wrapped in her quilt. Tahano stood, leaning slightly on the table. He didn't speak. He didn't move. The silence stretched. Then Chaska stepped forward. Laura Bullion didn't block the door, but she didn't move either. She looked him in the eye and spoke the first words. He's safe here. Chaska's eyes returned to hers. They softened barely. I know, he said, voice low and graveled like sand across stone. Behind him, the warriors remained still. Laura Bullion stepped aside. Chaska entered the cabin like a man walking into memory. Slow. Respectful. As if each floorboard might carry something sacred. He reached Tahano. The boy stood tall, chin lifted. Chaska placed a hand on his son's shoulder. You lived. Tahano nodded once. You ran. I stayed alive. Chaska closed his eyes for a moment. Then opened them. You did well. No tears. No embraces. Just the exchange of breath, the reconnection of blood. Laura Bullion stood back, watching, hands clasped at her waist. Chaska turned to her. From a pouch at his side, he drew a narrow strip of leather, beaded with red and turquoise, threaded with a small feather at the end. He held it out. For the one who warmed my son, he said. Laura Bullion hesitated, then accepted it. The leather was warm from his hand. She could feel the weight of the feather sway as if stirred by breath alone. You came with many men, she said. I came for only one, Chaska replied. She nodded. Then why do they still watch? Chaska turned and looked to the treeline, where his warriors waited like statues. One does not walk into the place where your son was last seen alive without all the strength you have left. Laura Bullion's throat tightened. They mean no harm? Unless you give it. She looked at Tahano. He doesn't want to leave. He doesn't have to. That surprised her. Chaska continued. He must choose. The boy who ran may return. But the boy who stood, who kept his fire, may stay where he is welcomed. Tahano said nothing. Just looked between them. Then a voice outside broke the stillness. It was sharp. Angry. One of the warriors had stepped forward. Young. Fierce-eyed. He shouted in Navajo, and though Laura Bullion didn't understand the words, she knew what they meant. The boy should not stay. It dishonors the blood. Chaska turned toward the door. Laura Bullion stepped forward. What did he say? Chaska sighed. He says a warrior's son belongs among warriors. That the snow has softened him. That's not true, Tahano said firmly. The snow taught me how to live. The words were like stones thrown into a still pond. Chaska glanced back at his son. Then he stepped outside. Laura Bullion and Tahano followed. The warrior who'd spoken stood with his arms crossed, a knife sheathed at his belt. His eyes burned with fire, not toward Tahano, but toward Chaska. More words in Navajo. Loud. Accusing. Chaska didn't raise his voice. He answered in measured tones. But the younger man unsheathed his blade. Laura Bullion's breath caught. Her hand went to the edge of her dress where the small pistol lay hidden. But Chaska moved first. With one step, one swing of his forearm, he struck the knife from the warrior's hand and brought him to his knees. The act was not violent. It was swift. Controlled. The warrior remained frozen, breath heaving, head bowed. Chaska spoke again, calmer now. And then silence. The warrior rose, retrieved his knife, and returned to the line. Chaska turned to Tahano. This is your choice. You are not the boy who ran anymore. Tahano looked at Laura Bullion, then at the snow, then back at his father. I want to stay, he said. Chaska didn't blink. You will see me again, he said. When spring melts the silence. He stepped forward and placed a beaded strip into Tahano's hand. For strength. Then to Laura Bullion, for both of you. He turned, mounted his horse, and with a simple gesture, the riders wheeled and vanished into the snow like they'd never been there at all. Only the silence remained. And the boy standing in the doorway of a woman's home, not as a stranger, but as something more. That evening, as the sun dipped low in gold, Tahano hung the beaded strip near the window where the light could catch it. Laura Bullion watched him, her hands folded, breath slow. The fire burned quietly. Outside the tracks began to fade. But in her chest, something had just begun to glow. The snow had begun to melt. Not fast. Not wide. But just enough to show the edges of the world again, patches of brown earth breaking through the white like skin beneath a scab. The air still carried the bite of winter, but the wind had shifted. It no longer whispered warnings. It whispered change. Tahano woke before Laura Bullion. He dressed slowly, carefully, pulling the 2 large boots tight with string, knotting them with fingers that had grown steadier in the days since he'd arrived. He moved with less limp now, though the wound still ached if he leaned too far forward. But he bore it like someone who understood pain was a cost, not a curse. Laura Bullion stirred at the sound of the door creaking open. She blinked in the morning light, hand reaching instinctively toward the rifle beside her, then relaxing when she saw him. Tahano stood just outside, face lifted toward the sun. His hair caught the light. The beaded strip from his father's hand hung loosely at his side. She stepped up beside him. The land looked different in daylight. Softer. Less like a battlefield. The snow sparkled under a pale gold sky, the cabin casting a long, lonely shadow behind them. Your leg holding up? She asked. He nodded. They didn't speak for a while. They just watched the horizon. Then, without turning, he said, You think they'll come back? She didn't have to ask who. Yes, she said. But not with anger. Tahano looked at her, brows drawn. You saw it in your father's eyes, she said. He let you choose. He wouldn't do that if he meant to take it back. The boy was quiet a moment, then asked, What if others don't agree? Laura Bullion exhaled. Then they'll have to learn what your father did. He tilted his head. What's that? She looked down at him. That a boy can become something new and still belong to the old. The wind stirred the beads in his hand. They clicked softly like distant chimes. A sound broke their quiet, a crack of branches. They both turned. Footprints. Fast. Heavy. The same young warrior who had drawn a blade 2 nights ago now burst from the trees on foot, blood on his sleeve, his eyes wild with urgency. He shouted something in Navajo. Then again louder. Tahano stepped forward, translating as the man reached them. My father is wounded. The words hit like a blow to the ribs. Laura Bullion grabbed the rifle. Where? Tahano pointed toward the trees. Close. Maybe 20 minutes walk. Laura Bullion didn't hesitate. She grabbed a satchel, clean cloth, her last jar of honey, boiled water, thread, the curved needle she never thought she'd use again. Tahano moved too. You're staying, she said. No, he said. She opened her mouth to argue, but something in his stance stopped her. There was no fear. No boy. Only resolve. They followed the warrior across the snow-choked path, through the thinning trees where sunlight filtered like fire through old lace. The trail was uneven, scattered with prints that led to a small clearing by a half-frozen creek. Chaska lay against a fallen log, his chest rising slow and shallow. Blood soaked his tunic. One hand gripped his side. His eyes were closed. Laura Bullion dropped beside him, hands already moving. Arrow, the warrior said. Snapped in the fight. He got it out but not clean. Laura Bullion nodded, brushing snow from his skin. The wound was deep, jagged, already beginning to swell. She poured water over it, ignoring the cold that burned her knuckles. Hold him, she said. Tahano knelt beside his father, placing a hand on his shoulder. Chaska's eyes opened briefly. He looked at Laura Bullion, then at his son. His mouth moved. No sound. But the look was clear. Let it be done. Laura Bullion worked quickly, hands steady, her breath misting in front of her. She packed honey into the wound. Stitched tight. Pressed warmth into his chest with her palms. And all the while she talked. Not to Chaska. To Tahano. Hold here. Good. Now breathe with him. The boy did. His voice stayed low, soft, steady. The bleeding slowed. Chaska's breaths evened. When she was sure he would hold, Laura Bullion sat back, pressing her hands against her thighs. Her fingers ached from cold and pressure, but she said nothing. Tahano looked at her. "You saved him." She shook her head. "You did." "No," he said. "You taught me how." They left Chaska under watch with the warrior. He was sleeping now, wrapped in Laura Bullion's cloak, the fire crackling beside him. The warrior bowed as they turned to go. The sun had risen higher. Birds were out. Spring was near. Back at the cabin, the wind carried a warmth it hadn't before. Laura Bullion set the rifle aside. Tahano poured water from the kettle without being asked. They worked side by side quietly with no need to explain. She watched him as he moved, a boy who had once been a shadow in snow. Now rooted. She opened her drawer and drew out something small, a carved button from her son's coat. She held it out. "Keep it," she said. Tahano looked at it, confused. "Why?" "Because some things you carry to remember who you were, and some things to remind you who you're becoming." He nodded, curling his fingers around it. That night they sat on the porch. Stars spilled like river stones across the sky. The prairie stretched wide and dark. "You ever been somewhere with this many stars?" she asked. He nodded. "Once. But I was too young to look up." She smiled. "You'll see them clearer now." He didn't answer right away. Then softly, "I think I was always meant to find this place." Laura Bullion turned to him. "This place didn't exist until you came." A silence settled between them. Not the kind that holds fear. The kind that holds peace. Later she would tell herself it had always been moving toward this. That every wound, every winter, every still night by the fire was waiting for this chapter to begin. And when she looked over and saw him fast asleep on the porch bench, arms crossed, breath slow and even, she reached out, brushed a strand of hair from his eyes. He didn't stir. But his hand opened slightly, revealing the beaded strip in one palm and the wooden button in the other. And she knew. He had chosen her. As much as she had chosen him. Some stories aren't written with thunder or blood. Some are carved in silence, mended in firelight, and told by how two people sit beside one another after the danger has passed. She sat back, wrapped herself in the quilt, and watched the stars shift. And somewhere in the hush of the wind, the land whispered what the world now knew. That a boy who once walked alone through snow now had a home he would never need to run from again. And the woman who opened her door that morning didn't just save a life. She found hers again, warm, whole, and quietly burning.